guys, I've been the biggest idiot possible. So it is Sunday afternoon today. I normally upload a video at 1 PM on a Sunday, and I did that today, and it was my history video, so looking at buying and selling horses in the Georgian period of time. And I was watching a little bit of it, even though I watched it goodness knows how many times before I uploaded it. And I noticed that I had got the maths completely wrong on the cost of horses back in that period of time, like completely wrong. So much so that I had to remove the video. And worst of all, I have got rid of all the kind of information that I'd written down on this period of time. I'd got rid of all the paintings that I'd found to be able to put up on the screen. I got rid of all the footage that I had filmed beforehand. And this is actually the second time I've done this. So this is my third attempt at videoing it. I'm having to start completely afresh again. I'm gutted, I'm devastated. I often find I have to take these videos quite a few times over because I kind of, forget what I've said or forget a vital piece of information. And because I chucked away all the kind of info that I'd written down in my notebook, I'm gonna have to do it off the top of my head this time round. I've got a couple of dates that I managed to salvage, and that's it. And I am just devastated because as much as I have absorbed so much of this information, I'm not sure whether I'm gonna be able to tell you guys it completely. But do you know what? I absolutely loved researching this period of time. It was so interesting, and I think you guys will really love it. So I know it's the right thing to redo this video, but oh goodness me, I am an absolute donut. So I'm going back to the Georgian period of time, as I've already said. Normally I don't go further back than the Victorians because the Victorians were just so well documented. There's photos, there's little footage of film available from that time. And so it's really easy to research it. But the further you go back in time, the harder it is to research and find out information. And especially on horses, actually, there's not huge amounts of info on how horses were kept and kind of the way they were looked after back in the Georgian period of time. So we're looking around 1714 to 1837, so quite a large time scale. And we are specifically looking in London because London was like the hub for selling and buying horses. It was the place to go. You got great choice in London. You could get broodmares, hacks, hunters, racehorses, carriage horses. They could all be found in London. So people would come from quite far afield to buy their new steed in London because, like I say, this was the place. And London was booming in this period of time. There was a lot of growth. Industry and manufacturing was really starting to grow because where in the past they'd used human power to work these industries, they'd started to use horsepower. Horses are the unsung heroes in the Georgian period without a shadow of a doubt. Horsepower is why it suddenly started to grow so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the video. So moving back to buying and selling horses in this time. So to give you a little bit of a rough idea of the prices of horses in Georgian period, again, it's not the most well documented, so this is a bit of a rough guide. But if you wanted to buy a very fancy carriage horse, you'd be looking around the £100 mark. If you were buying a racehorse, a little bit more than that. They were kind of like the high-end sums of money that would be seen at auctions. If you wanted to buy your kind of middle-class carriage horse, your hack, a nice hunter, you'd probably be looking around the kind of £60 mark, £70 mark. If you were buying your cob or your average hack that had been broken in, but did its job, would hack around, be quite nice, but nothing too special, you'd be probably looking between £25 and £50. Ponies would be a little bit less than that. And then kind of bottom of the pile would be either young horses that weren't broken in or scrub horses. And again, I'll talk a little bit later about scrub horses. And where would you go and find these horses to buy? So auction houses, horse and carriage repositories, big yards. There would be livery yards going around. You could go to fairs and markets as well. So there were plenty of places you could go to buy yourself a new steed or sell one in this instance. And buying a horse in this period of time was expensive. It was big business. I mean, London, the horse trade was worth £255,000. It was big, this trade. There was some 25,500 horses sold in 1800 just in London. So we're not talking about the rest of the country, just in London, sold in 1 year. So it was seriously big business. And people made a lot of money from buying and selling horses. Now, for your very rich sporting gentleman, buying a fancy horse showed your rank, it showed your wealth, it showed your status. So, it was big business for the gentleman to go and buy himself a beautiful, elegant, fancy horse because, you know, it showed off his money. And thoroughbreds were very popular back then because they were fast, they were elegant, they were beautiful to look at. The Georgians loved a beautiful horse. So, you know, horses meant money, horses meant wealth, horses meant status. Not only buying a nice horse was expensive, but also upkeep of a horse in London was incredibly expensive. You are looking at stabling it, you've got to, or putting it in a stall, you've got to feed it hay, you've got to bed it up on straw, you've got to give it hard feed, you might have tack for it, you might have harnesses for it, you would need a carriage for them to go in, you would have a groom that would look after it, you've got veterinary bills, you've got the blacksmith to see it. It was actually cheaper to pay a servant than it was to owning a horse yearly in London. Like, horses were so expensive. You know, owning a horse really was a huge expense. So some people did choose to rent horses, and this was again quite a popular thing to do in London, especially like the horse and carriage repositories. And to give you an idea of a repository, it was like a car showroom, an urban car showroom. You know, downstairs, hopefully I'm going to put a picture on the screen now of what a horse repository used to look like. And actually this one in the image now is in London and has very recently been listed as grade 2 and kind of saved because it really is a piece of history. And this is the last remaining horse and carriage repository in London. And being that there was a fair few back in the time, the fact that this is the very last remaining one, I'm so glad it's been saved and it hasn't been demolished or anything like that, like all the rest have. So a horse repository was somewhere where you could buy horses, you could rent horses, you could sell horses from there. There'd be auctions taking place there. So downstairs, you can see in the picture, you had where the carriages were. So they'd be on display for people to go and look at. Then you'd go upstairs. Yes, horses went upstairs. It's sometimes up like a ramp, sometimes up actual stairs. And then they'd go in the stalls up there. And again, prospective buyers could have a look around at the steeds, see if there's one that suited them. And quite often they would rent horses from these places. And to rent a horse and a carriage and a coachman in this period of time, so 2 horses, you would be looking at around £200 to £300 a year. That's such a lot of money back then. That was huge amounts of money. So everything, I mean, it's like the same now, but everything revolving around a horse cost a lot of money. Also, taxing. Georgians were absolutely huge on taxing. There was a tax for everything, and that included horses. So that was another thing that people had to kind of factor in when owning a horse. That if you owned a pleasure horse, a hunt horse, I think race horses, I could be wrong, don't quote me on that, then horses would be taxed annually. So that meant for a lot of people, they just couldn't own horses. It was just too much money. The upkeep of a horse and the paying of tax was just too much. Do you know pet dogs got taxed as well? I didn't know this. Pet dogs got taxed, which actually led to being loads of abandonments on the streets of London because people couldn't afford to feed their dogs and pay the tax on them. I think it was only working horses and working dogs that didn't get taxed. So yeah, very, very expensive. So you came into London looking for your new steed. If you were a very wealthy gentleman, your first stop would be Tattersalls Auction. And obviously Tattersalls Auction is around still to this day. And this was like the place to go. If you were rich and wealthy and wanted to be seen socialising with other rich and wealthy people, Tattersalls was the place to go. There was such a buzz of activity going on at Hyde Park Corner. And this was a beautiful place. You can see from the paintings that I'm putting up on the screen, this was a beautiful venue, a gorgeous auction house where, you know, the real lux of horses went through. These race horses that would go through here, very smart carriage horses, maybe a very posh hunter. This was the place to buy them from. Now, Tattersalls tended to sell around 4,000 horses a year. Now, the data I found suggested that they'd only go for around £10 a head. That's not correct. These were top quality horses, so you'd be much more looking at around kind of £75, probably past £100 for these beautiful steeds, maybe up to 150, around that kind of figure. The posh horses, these were the ones that were in good health, well bred, could do a good job. Maybe they were still quite young, you know, had been broken in, but they were at the kind of start of their life. Remember, back then horses did not survive that long compared to our horses nowadays. I mean, you'd be lucky if, you know, your horse working in the carriages made it to kind of 11 or 12 years. I mean, the horses working on the streets, pulling, the horses that worked on the streets day in, day out, maybe you were lucky if they made it to 10. Horses that were working in like private homes would go on a little bit longer because they wouldn't quite have the abuse of working day in, day out. They maybe get to kind of 12, 13, 14, but horses did not get to the ages that our horses get to nowadays because they just worked so hard. They were worked to the ground. They worked till their death. But yes, Tattersalls was where the posh horses went, the fancy horses went, and where the gentlemen who had lots of money could go and spend their pennies. Do you know what? They also sold dogs at that auction as well. So you could also buy, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think greyhounds were sold there as well. So yeah, an absolute hive of activity for the very rich gentlemen would go on at Tattersalls. Now, dropping down to kind of the middle road, these were still nice carriage horses. This was the kind of middle class, working class gentleman's place to buy a horse, and that was Aldridge's. Sometimes it's called Aldridge's Bazaar, sometimes it's called a repository, sometimes it is called an auction. I mean, pretty much it's a place to sell horses. It's an auction, let's go with that. And Aldridge's was, you know, nice quality horses, you know, not as nice as Tattersalls, but they weren't bottom of the end market. They were still good steeds that could go on and do good jobs. Again, there would be quite a hive of activity going on there. It would be a busy place. They'd probably sell around 2,000 horses a year. I'm guessing making around the £50 mark on average. Obviously, it completely depends on the appearance, the health, the look of the horse. But that was a very popular and busy place as well. And then, of course, you could also buy horses, like I say, from the horse and carriage repositories. So there were quite a few of these dotted around London. There's one called Finsbury. There was one called Longhorns. Annoyingly, I had a whole list of them and they were on my notes that I've chucked away. But there was I think I've read somewhere, there was something like 50 odd horse and carriage repositories dotted around London in that period of time. So there was a lot, and there was probably more. I mean, there was inns, there were stable yards, there were liveries, and these are all places where you could buy horses from. So they might sell between 1,000 and 2,000 a year. So still a lot of horses going through there. Again, there would have been a bit more of a range of horses there, so you probably wouldn't get your high-end ones. But you'd certainly get kind of like your average cob, your hack, your kind of average carriage horse, that kind of thing. And then we moved to the bottom of the pile and Smithfield Market. So Smithfield Market is colossal. It was huge. It's still around to this day. It's been there since medieval times, and it's always been known as a livestock market. I think back in the medieval times it might have been known as Smoothfield or something like that. As you know, as time goes by, quite often names of places have changed slightly. So it may have been Smoothfield and then it changed to Smithfield, which makes total sense. And yeah, this was a huge livestock market. And you can see from the paintings I put on the screen, this place was colossal. They were selling sheep, pigs, chickens, cows, horses. You could buy your tack, your harnesses there. You could buy horse feed, straw, hay. You could buy your meat from there. I mean, just pretty much everything and anything that came with livestock. And this place was huge, absolutely huge. Can you imagine the smells and the sounds coming from this place? It'd have been something else, wouldn't it? It'd have been absolutely something else. Would have quite liked to have been a fly dotting around then to have watched. I mean, there was a lot going on at Smithfield Market. Lots of it not very good. Police often got quite involved there because they used to trot the horses up and down the streets surrounding Smithfield Market and making quite a noise for the people that lived around the area, and they got very upset. And also supposedly the horse dealers selling at Smithfield Market were very unlawful. So yes, the police quite often got involved, but I imagine the police got involved for many other things as well there. Smithfield Market is where scrub horses were sold. So this was the kind of cheap end of the market. These were horses that were broken. They were at the end of their life. They had been overworked, they were injured, they were lame, they were blind. They were horses that had just, you know, they were at the end of their life. They couldn't give much more. You might also get a few young stock horses in through, things that hadn't been broken in, but it is very much documented that these are all called scrub horses. And these horses would either be sold to the meat man from there. They'd go for around £5, maybe a bit under, maybe a little bit over, depending on the quality of the horse. But yep, meat man. Also mill horses. So for anyone that doesn't know, as I said, there was a lot of industry and growth in manufacturing in London at this period of time, and mills, there were loads of mills dotted across London. There'd be like a tanning mill, so they would take the bark and it would be grinded and it would be grinded up and then added to water to make the tanning solution that would be used to tan leather. And horses would be used to move the millstone that would be grinding the material, the bark up. So horsepower, this is why I said horsepower was so important, but horses would be working in the waterworks, the ironworks, starch factories, paint factories, all grinding material up with these big concretey kind of stones that would go round. I'm hopefully putting some pictures on the screen because I'm not explaining it very well in the slightest. But the mills would happily buy scrub horses because they were cheap, and also because they felt that they only had to go round in circles, so it wasn't a lot to ask of these horses. So if they were lame or blind, it wouldn't really matter. They just had to go round in circles, which is awful. The problem with this period of time, the more you think about it and the more you learn about it, the worse it is, because you realise that horses really didn't have a good life back then. They weren't well cared for, they weren't treated well, they were overworked, they were abused, to be honest. They were abused. But for many people in that period of time, life was really hard. So it does make sense. Was it fair? No, of course not. It's animal abuse. Was it correct? Not in the slightest. But for this period of time, horses were workhorses. They weren't so much pets like they are to us nowadays. And yeah, so mill horses were often brought from Smithfield Market, and yeah, going into all those different industries and manufacturing. Maybe also somebody that couldn't afford very much, maybe they would try and find a horse that perhaps still do another year or two for them pulling a cart or something like that, then this would be the place to buy them. But yes, Smithfield Market was where you bought kind of, sadly, the horses that were on their final legs and couldn't give much more. Annually, Smithfield Market sold around, well, they exposed around 13,000 horses up for sale. So this didn't mean they actually sold that many. They sold only around 7,000, but that's still a lot of horses. I mean, 7,000 horses going through Smithfield Market annually was a huge amount. Like I say, not going for huge amounts of money, varying in prices depending on kind of what stage that horse was at and what it could still continue to do. Quite often the horses were sold on Friday afternoon, so different days of the week for different animals that were sold. So for example, cows might be on a Monday or sheep might be on a Monday. I had it written down. I don't have it in front of me now, but yes, horses generally were sold on a Friday afternoon. Now, big problem that was had in the Georgian period when it came to buying and selling horses was horse thieves. So of course, just like we have car thieves, they had horse thieves, and horse thieves would steal horses out of fields from as far afield as Somerset, Leicestershire, Oxfordshire. They'd steal the horse, ride it into London. Now, I mean, if you think about it, from Somerset to London on horseback, I mean, surely that must take weeks. That must take weeks. I mean, that's no quick trip, is it? I mean, you'd have to hope you stole a pretty good horse to ride in that far. Imagine if you stole something horrible. That'd be an awful ride for a very long time, wouldn't it? So they'd ride these stolen steeds, and I don't know, maybe they stole a few at a time and would do ride and lead, who knows? But they would take them into London and then they would put them into a market or an auction, and then they would get the money for them. Now, this obviously was great business for the thieves. You know, they could make a few good pennies of doing this. However, occasionally, the owners of these horses actually managed to find them in the auctions before they were sold and would get the police involved. And I read a really interesting story that came from the Old Bailey about a thief called John Barton who had stolen a black 15-1 gelding from a field in North Hampshire and had ridden it, or taken it into London. I assume he'd ridden it into London. He'd left it at Longhorn's Horse and Carriage Repository where he wanted it to be sold so that he could get the pennies. And there was an auction going on there. And the owner of this black gelding, who was trying to find their horse, came to Longhorn's, found their horse for sale there, got the police involved, and this is how John Barton ended up at the Old Bailey. It turned out John Barton did lie quite a lot. So he lied about stealing the horse, but he also got other people involved, including a stable jockey, to lie for him. And he was convicted. It's a very long story, so I've obviously given you a very shorthand version of it. But he got convicted, and sadly, he was sentenced to death. Now, I didn't realise that that could be the penalty. Now, I knew obviously being sentenced to death back in the Georgian period was quite common, but I didn't realise that, you know, for just stealing a horse, maybe it was because he got other people to lie, I don't know, that, you know, that was his life gone. So, you know, for the horse thieves, it was quite a juggle, like, you know, stealing horses, earning money, stealing horses, I could get caught, I could end up dying. You know, quite difficult. You know, risky business, that one. So yeah, so buying and selling horses in London in the Georgian period was big business, big business. All types were sold in London, and it was the place to go. You wanted to get yourself a very nice horse, or a horse at the end of its tether, or whatever, broodmare, whatever you wanted, you went to London to get it. I hope it's been of some interest. I really hope I haven't forgotten anything major when I look back over this and try and re-edit it. I really hope I did, but fingers crossed I haven't. And yeah, that you enjoyed this story. Again, I am so sorry that it's had to come all off the top of my head, and I just really hope I have remembered everything. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed.